Hi, everybody. This is Julia, aka Mama Mo, and I'm here with Cindy Hovington. Cindy, I would love for you to introduce yourself. I'm so happy for more people to get to know you on my side. Here we go.
Thank you. Yes. So my name is Cindy Hovington, and I have a PhD in neuroscience, and I'm a mom of three. And what I've been doing for the past couple of years is running something called Curious Neuron. And Curious Neuron is all about bringing science, making it accessible for parents. Because as somebody with a PhD in neuroscience, I just felt that there was a lot out there that was related to parenting, and specifically my area of focus, which was emotions and emotional health and mental health. And I felt that there was a lot that we needed to know as parents. So I created the blog first, and now I have the podcast as well. I've had it for a couple of years. We are supported by McGill University and the Neuro, specifically in the Tannenbaum Open Science Institute here in Montreal. And I'm so grateful that we are supported by a university, because that is what I want to do. I want to make sure that the work they do is accessible to parents. Mental health is something that we hear a lot about, and especially with young kids, this right now, after, did we say after yet? I don't know. After
Yeah.
and during this pandemic, we've heard of the numbers that have risen and have really skyrocketed, and we say that we're in this crisis of mental health in kids and youth, but we were already there before the pandemic. Numbers were already, we see the rise was already there. It just got worse after. And I truly believe that when it comes to mental health, that we need to educate the parent and work on the parent and support the parent. And that should start as of birth, as of the moment that the parent finds out, even before the birth of their child. But the moment they find out they're expecting, I truly believe that there should be more of a support system to help parents, because their mental health matters and impacts their child. And we need to have more of these conversations. So that's the work that I do with Curious Neuron.
So I've been listening to the podcast for some time now. I love it. I love all the conversations that you have. Some of them are so simple, but they're also, yeah, like you say, backed by science. So it kind of makes you feel, okay, a little bit at ease. This makes sense. And it
Mm.
sounds very easy, but this is scientific proof that there are good things to do that you can do
There are.
at home that are not difficult. And I love that about your podcast. I find it very easy to listen to, and it's a wealth of information. So thank you. I appreciate it
Thank
so
you.
much. We are on a little bit of a different area. You know, you've got younger kids, I've got teenagers, but I find like all the information is important. And like you were saying, mental health has existed and been in a it's been in the closet. You know, it's
Yeah.
been something that we've all had to deal with, and you know, at different places, different times in our lives, and especially with families. And I find that, like you were saying, this pandemic didn't necessarily magnify it, but it kind of put a spotlight on it.
Yes.
And so now we're kind of faced with this. Everybody knows it exists, and we need to find out how to deal with it. So I think that that is something that, you know, your focus is on right now. And I think
Hmm.
it's so important. So do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and you're right. It magnified it. I think it like just brought the problem up to the surface a little bit. It's like sifting through sand, and then you see the big pieces. It was there. It wasn't. It was present in our society. And I think that we don't have enough of a system that supports parents and supports their specific needs. Like when
Mm.
it comes to their own emotional and mental health, and then supporting their child. And that's what we're seeing now. We're seeing children. I'm getting a lot of calls from schools that are asking for talks for teachers and for parents, and their focus is always on aggressive behavior and misbehavior and how do we handle all this bad behavior. And
Mm.
what's interesting is whenever I have this talk, I always bring it back to mental health and emotional health. And
Yeah.
they're like, no, what about the behavior part? I'm like, it'll come. It's there. Let me talk about it. So I start with the emotional health
Yeah.
and the something called emotion regulation skills. And that is something, and attachment and all of that. And once I paint the picture of a child who struggles with behavior, and that there's a parenting style within the home, the environment impacts their behavior,
Yeah.
their mental health, their ability to regulate or cope or manage with emotions will impact all of that. Once I paint the full picture, they're like, oh, okay, that makes sense. So
Yeah.
like, it's not, I think we've been zooming in a lot on kids and their behaviors or misbehaviors, and we're missing the point that this emotion regulation, this ability to regulate yourself internally and then regulate your external representation of this emotion, which is a behavior,
Mm-hmm.
we're forgetting that that's a big part of mental health when it comes to a child, that if we sort of ignore that, we're going to see children without skills to regulate emotions.
Yeah.
And then it also takes another extra second for me to say, think about your childhood, to the parents, and they're like, oh. Like
Yeah.
they think, right, like emotion regulation skills are built when we're young, so there's a lot of research around that and how the early environment impacts that. So if we were raised in an environment, which, to speak about myself, and there's nothing wrong with that, like I think my mom didn't know any better because she was raised that way, but
Right.
any sort of negative or uncomfortable emotion was, you were told, like, suck it up, like, or there's nothing to be afraid of, there's nothing in the dark, let me close the door, leave
Right.
you alone in the dark, and you'll get over it at some point, right? It wasn't about like, or even sadness, it's like, well, and I see my grandma do this still, it's like, oh, you're feeling sad, here, have a cookie.
Yeah.
And I think it came from a place of just not knowing, which is okay.
Yes.
But now there's so much research, especially as of around the 1990s, when emotional intelligence came to the forefront. We know how important emotions are,
Mm.
not only for our mental health, but our child's academic school career, like their grades, their relationships, their friendships, their career, their marriages later on,
Yeah.
and how they parent, and eventually. And that's where we are now, our generation of parents. We didn't get those skills. And what's happening is that we are now in front of these young kids having big emotions and tantrums and meltdowns and frustration, and they're yelling and they're screaming, and we're like, I don't know what to do with this.
Yeah.
This is bad. Let me discipline this, when it's not when they need what they need. So
Mm-hmm.
that's what I'm trying to bring to the forefront. There's literally research around every aspect of what I just said. So my goal through the podcast is to have these conversations, first myself as a mom of three. Sometimes I have these like solo episodes where I say, like, I saw this, in public, or this happened within my home. Here's what I did and why. Here's the research. Because it's nice to know as a parent, like, a lot of people tell us what to do, but nobody tells us why, including like unsolicited advice from family or strangers. But I want to make sure that the parents know, like, here's the why behind I did that, like the reason why I did this. And then when I don't know the reason for it, or like I read an article and I'm like, hey, this article is really interesting, and it talks about how teenagers actually want to spend time with their parents and that it improves their mental health. Hold on a second. I'll email the researcher and invite them on the podcast, and we
Yeah.
have deeper conversation about it, because I'm curious. I want to know why. What sort of research did you find around that? So
Yeah.
that's the whole goal of the podcast.
I love that. And I think that the long form of the conversation backed with science really helps for people to understand. I mean, I know we're in the age of, quick fixes and very
Yes.
short form
Yeah.
videos and, scrolling. And unfortunately, that's, what we're used to now. But I know that podcasts are booming. It's my favorite thing to listen to when I'm doing everything.
Same. Yeah.
Everything.
Yeah.
That's the right word,
Yeah.
everything. But do you find that it's a little bit of a conflict with maybe a younger generation, like younger parents, younger mentalities, let's say, of parenting?
Yeah. With the work that I'm doing, or the podcast itself? Because
Just trying to reach them.
yeah, so, and that's why I have an Instagram account, because I have to be mindful of the different people out there and what makes sense for them. The podcast, I do receive emails from, honestly, I get a lot of grandparents, a lot of grandparents that write to me and they say, thank you, I'm relearning like what I need to do now with my
Oh,
grandchild, and all ages. So the podcast, and I actually have dads too that email me from the podcast specifically saying, I listened to this episode. So I think the podcast is just allowing anybody, like people in the car, or moms tell me like they're walking with their newborn and they listen to podcasts.
mm,
I do it while I'm folding laundry, like I listen to the
yep,
podcast. So I think it's a good way to dig deeper for somebody who wants that. But then every single piece of information is also part of a blog post, is also part of an Instagram reel. That's an art that I had to learn along the way, because at the beginning, I mean, coming out of research, I was used to like these really heavy jargon, like just heavy articles.
sure.
And I if you look at my first blog post, I was like, oh, that's not good at all. But that's what I was used to. It was like a scientific article and all this
That was your
kind of.
language.
It was my language. And
Yeah.
then I came into the real world out of like a research lab, And I would talk to people and like their eyes would go like cross-eyed, like, what are you talking about? Amygdala, hippocampus, like what are you? And I had to realize, okay, how do I take this information that I know is facts, in science, and make it applicable and digestible? And now, because of social media, also bite-sized, so that
Yeah.
parents can take this and understand it. So one article is divided into so many different types of content, and it took 2 years, about 2 years, to really learn how to do that. And even now, when I have a graduate student that joins the team, it takes about 3 months for me to work with them, and they keep taking an article, they write about it, I say, no, let's try it again. And it takes 3 months of doing that, because then eventually they're able to see from a different lens of like, oh, this was important to me as a neuroscientist, but it's not important to a parent. This part is important to a parent because it's actually applicable. And sometimes it's just like a scale that they're using in that study, and it says, here's how we measured emotional awareness or emotion regulation, like, or your acceptance of your emotions. Like when you feel angry, do you say, do you have negative thoughts, for example? Like that little sentence to me stands out, because it reminds me as a mom, like, oh yeah, I do have negative thoughts and I need to try to change that part. And that's going to impact my emotions, and that's going to impact how I speak to my kids or deal with their emotions as well. So it's like little hidden gems within studies that you have to look for.
Yes. And that you can find, right?
Yes.
You're
Yeah.
able to read that and find that. And that's why we appreciate your podcast so much. And truthfully, the Instagram account is booming. I love it so much too. It's just little bite-sized pieces. So for anybody, right, they have the option of listening to the long form or the short form. I listen to both.
Thank you.
So we had put down a couple of notes here of what we really wanted to cover. We've already talked about so much, but let's go back to the parent, because I know that it involves, going back to our childhood, how we were brought up. And I think, like you're saying, the 90s, this is not that long ago,
No.
but for us, our childhood experience might be fantastic, but it didn't necessarily cover emotions the way that we are covering them now, and mental well-being. So do you want to cover that a little
Yeah.
bit?
Yeah, I love that question, because I was having a conversation with somebody a couple months ago, and it stood out to me because he was telling me, everybody's always saying like, go back to your past, and there's some sort of trauma or something bad that happened that like leads to the reason why you are like why you who you are today. And he said, I had such a good childhood. I don't have anything to go back to. Everything was perfect. So I said, I think that's sort of the direction of where we're going as a society. We're really focusing on that, but you don't have to have had like a bad childhood. And then I started talking about emotions. I said, how were emotions perceived within your home? And he's like, we were never nobody ever got mad at us for being angry or sad. And I said, okay, that's good. I said, and then what happened when you were sad? It's like, oh, well, my mom would make us some cookies, and then we'd watch a movie together and spend time together, because it was really lovely. And I said, sure, that's also great. But
Right.
now, as an adult, and a male adult, what do you do when you're sad? He's like, I don't know. I brush it away. Like I try to be strong and I deal with it. And I was like, there we go. Because that's what, so there's always a point of our childhood, and it's not to point fingers at our parents
No.
again. It's just, they didn't know, this research wasn't there before. So what we hear now is like, sit with your sadness. And many of us, including the moms and the parents that I speak with through Curious Neuron, they're like, what does that mean to sit with your sadness? And it just means, it's uncomfortable, first of all, and we naturally do it with our kids of like, they're sad, but I want to help you be happy, and that's okay. But what sort of tools do they have to be able to say like, I just want to be sad for a couple of minutes, an hour if I have to, today, all day if I have to.
Right.
But then at some point you do have to cope with it. But being okay with that uncomfortable feeling of like, I'm so frustrated, or I'm so disappointed with something, or so sad about something that happened, and not trying to push it away so quickly, that's what sitting with it is. So all of that, again, it comes from what we learned as a child. And if our parents naturally wanted us to brush it off, or say there's nothing wrong with it, like, or not
Right.
nothing wrong with it, but like there's nothing to be afraid of right now, or there's nothing to be sad about, like you think you're sad, but like really I just gave you the blue cup that you asked for, with a toddler, and then they lose it. And you're like, there's nothing, stop crying, just stop crying, there's nothing to be sad about. But in that child's brain there is a reason. And all that circuitry and that wiring is happening. And it's like, if there's a consistency of that environment of like, stop being sad or stop being afraid of everything, there's nothing to be afraid of, without
Feel like you can't be sad.
yes, and then they internalize. So obviously for us, it doesn't make sense when our child is crying because they got the blue cup and they asked for the blue cup, and it's frustrating as an adult. But if we just keep pushing that emotion down for them or telling them there's nothing to cry about or to stop crying, they eventually start to internalize and say, well, this is not an emotionally safe space for me. They're not verbalizing that, but their brain
Right.
is saying, nope, when I'm in distress or I'm really stressed, this is not a person or a space or an environment to allow that to be expressed. So this emotional part of our brain, they're connected to, like, the amygdala is connected to the prefrontal cortex behind our forehead. And that part of the brain is saying, hey, I'm feeling, so the amygdala is the emotions and says, I'm feeling frustrated. And the frontal lobe says, well, let's assess the situation right now. There's no reason to be frustrated. Or it
Right.
says, let's say your boss says something to you. It says, your frontal lobe says, don't flip the desk. It's not a great time to flip the desk. But a child doesn't have that part of the brain that's developed. So
Sure.
they ask for something and we give it. But as we're giving it in that moment, they might be like, I think red's cooler than blue. But we don't see all that. We don't see inside
Right.
their brain. So as an adult, it's so frustrating because it's like, why? I gave you what you wanted. Like, what do you want from me? Like,
Right.
we're not used to dealing with that. But the child's brain is evolving and learning, and a lot of our response and our reaction and how we model emotions will impact how they do that later as adults. So we truly have to be mindful of that. And the more we are mindful, and it's not about perfection. There's
Right.
no such thing as perfection in parenting. And I want parents to know that, like, because often some people will say, well, as a neuroscientist, wow, like studying mental health and emotions, I'm sure that your child has never had a tantrum, and you've never had big emotions in your home, and you've never lost it, like, and I say,
Sure.
not only do my kids have tantrums, I have some too. because
you're
human.
human.
Exactly. Like, it's only normal. And that word tantrum, I'm also trying to change in society. I use it because it's still common, but we use it as a negative thing, but it's really an emotional dysregulated
Right.
moment in our kids. And we have them too. And the more we can see our kids, sometimes it's weird saying this out loud, but as humans, right? Not as like these little dysfunctional humans, but like, if they're humans and they have moments of dysregulation, just like we do. We have moments where we yell at them. We have moments where we yell at our partners, at family members. And it's part of our brain's ability to regulate, and a lot plays into that. So we really do have to be more aware, I think, as a society, of how we cope and manage with emotions, because it impacts our mental health, and how we are kind of teaching that to the next generation, because I think we can be more proactive as a society when it comes to mental health and emotional health. And it really starts when we find out that a parent is expecting, just teaching them everything we're talking about today, and having more support for them.
Yeah, I can tell you that, as a parent who lost both of my parents, grief played an extreme role in kind of teaching my kids how to deal with that, because they were 3 and 5 when my mother passed away. So their grandma passed away. And of course, at that age, they're very curious, have lots of questions, and they all handled this loss completely differently. So as a parent, not only was I dealing with my emotional well-being, but I was also trying to deal with 3 very different emotional states, sometimes all at the same time. Wow. And I found it very interesting, because it really taught me that each one of them had their own, obviously their own personality, but their own way of handling their mental state. So, for example, one of them would not be emotional at all, and then suddenly be very, outraged by something that had nothing to do with, at least for us to see, nothing that had to do with the grief. But if I peel back the layers, okay, that makes sense, right? So I think, oddly enough, that helped me to learn how to deal with them, and how to deal with them being able to express themselves when it came to their mental well-being. And I think they still use it today, obviously in different ways as teenagers, but they're trying, and they're not closed off. Like a lot of people say, teenagers, you just can't reach them. I don't have that as an experience at all, which I'm very grateful for. So we still have the conversations. And I think the other thing that I want to mention is that I have never shied away from showing my emotions to my kids, which I think is
So
really
important.
important.
Yeah.
And I think especially for three boys, having three boys, I really want them to see that we can be emotional and we can have, not a good moment and, cry or be upset, so long as we can express ourselves and the reason behind it. If it takes a while, it might take a while, but at least they can understand where it's coming from eventually, and we can talk about it. So that's something I've always done. And I always tell, parents, it's really important, especially if you're dealing with grief, don't hide away from it because your kids are dealing with it too. So if you can
Yes.
all try and talk about it, it'll help.
But even let's say like if a pet passes away, I think those are good opportunities to have these conversations. And sometimes parents will ask me, if that happens, like, do I just let them be and maybe not bring it up to like get them upset about it? Like I'll just avoid the whole conversation and bring it up once and that's it. And even somebody had emailed me once asking questions about like a nanny that was going to leave, and this person or this child had this nanny in their life for 5 years. And the parents were waiting for the day before so that there wasn't too much buildup of emotions to say like tomorrow's the last day, bye, and then it's over. And my response to both those questions are always take the time to talk about it. You don't, and maybe that comes from our own place of not being comfortable with emotions as well, right? Like
Right.
being around our child is super sad. It's uncomfortable for us and we want to make that go away. It's natural for us. We want them to be happy. But letting them sit in that sadness and just not having a solution to the problem, just being there. And that's what we need from our friends too and our partners sometimes. It's we want to be sad or mad in a moment. Don't give me a solution. Just let me vent or let me be sad. And I need a little bit of time. And our kids need that too. And the resilience comes from, resilience is a big topic as well with parents. And that resilience will come with these uncomfortable moments. And an uncomfortable moment could be saying no to your child because they want a cookie and it's bedtime. That's uncomfortable. Or a pet passing away and continuing that conversation with them, asking them how they're feeling. It's not that you're probing for emotions. You're just making sure that they're fine and showing them that you want to talk about emotions. You want to let it out. Is really important. And the modeling, like you said, it's true. Like that's another very common question. Like if I'm sad, is it okay to cry in front of my child? It's okay. It's obviously we have to make sure that if it's it's not developmentally appropriate, like the reason that you're crying, to make it developmentally appropriate. It's okay to say there's an adult thing going on in my life, something that's a bit complicated for you to understand, but I just want you to know that I am sad right now. That's why I'm crying, but I'm going to work through it. I know, tomorrow maybe I'll go for a walk. You want to come with me? Like little things that we can do with our kids to show them that emotions exist and that it's okay to experience and feel these emotions. But then there are ways to help yourself not move past it, but to kind of slowly move past it at your pace, especially with grief.
And I think with that, it also encouraged them to learn what empathy is. Because, as we were talking about social media, we are faced with so many different emotions, so many different feelings just by scrolling. We could see something funny, we could see something sad, and it could just numb us. And I think that a lot of kids and teenagers are dealing with that on a daily basis. So, not having the ability to express themselves or to understand emotions or empathize with humanity is real. It's a real thing right now. And like you were saying, we had this conversation prior, going on social media takes you away from you, right? You're able to just disassociate what you're having to deal with.
Yeah. It's social media is a whole other conversation.
Yeah.
There's a lot going on with that. A lot of research around teenagers as well, showing that just minimizing screen time or social media time to 1 hour a day improves a teenager's mental health. So it's not that they have to avoid it completely. We have to monitor what they're looking at and who they're hanging out with, because that's something I'm also very adamant about, that predators are online. It's not a hidden thing. They are there. And before the age of 16, I think we have to just be aware of what our kids are doing online. I was talking to my husband's like a family member, and she's 14 years old, and she said something to me over, I think it was the Easter break, and it marked me so much. She said she had her phone in her hand. She was, this thing As much as I love it, it causes me all my problems. It causes all the problems that I have.
Oh.
And to have the insight, she was like, there's a reason why, it's not good for us, but we're all on it. So what are we
Mhm.
supposed to do? And it's true. And it's just, I think as parents, we do need to have that conversation. And whether it's screen time in a 5-year-old, screen time in a 14 or 15-year-old, that is a different kind of screen time.
Right.
We do, these are kind of conversations that some people shy away from. And that's not what I do with Curious Neuron. I want to make sure that I address that in the podcast or blogs or Instagram, because we just need to hear what the science is around that, right?
Yeah.
Like there's a lot of misconceptions, or a lot of people, especially parents with young kids, parents are burnt out and they're tired, so they're using screen time. And it's not, I don't want anything that I do with Curious Neuron to point fingers. I
Right.
wanted to educate, and I want to help people be curious about these topics and
Mm.
say, hey, let me see, how much screen time am I, having in my home? Is
Yeah.
there a way for me to switch that to something else? Why am I using screen time? I was just reading an article this week that showed the higher the stress level in a parent of a child who's under the age of 5, the higher the screen time. It makes sense. We know
Yeah.
that because we're doing it too. And during weeks
Yeah.
where I'm sick or I'm tired, obviously there's more screen time. I get that.
Yeah.
But what can we do now? Because we can't just close our eyes and cross our fingers and hope that
No.
everything will be okay. We need to have these conversations.
Yeah. I agree with you. And I'm a big advocate for that as well.
Mm.
So we had talked about supporting parents in their parenting journey and helping their kids understand how to be more aware of their mental well-being. And we also talked about how parents need to look back into their childhood, into their their life, and how they were able to manage their emotions, or if they were even allowed to express
Mm.
themselves in their life. And like I had mentioned, my family looked very different for a lot of people in my era, let's say, in my decade of growing up in the 80s. But my parents came from families, that were my father came from a family coming in from Italy, that had so much weight on their shoulders coming into Canada with, 4 kids. And so emotions was just not a thing that they discussed. Whereas my father took that and was able to, change it for the next generation and deal with emotions and learn about emotions and, all the things that we know now that are more popular, whether it's like listening to calming music. Those were all things that my father had researched and
Wow.
integrated into our life, which was amazing.
Yeah.
So of course my childhood looks different than other people's childhood, and then I'm in turn doing that for my kids. But I wanted to talk briefly about, we had discussed it before, what it really does look like to be an emotionally aware parent right now.
That's the term I've been using a lot more, and that's what I'm trying to do with the podcast is really bring awareness to yourself, your emotions, and your child. So I think for me, emotional awareness is, I keep hearing the sentence from parents saying, I don't know what happened. I went from 0 to 100, or I snapped and I don't even know why. I think it's that pause, that sort of moment of understanding, well, what's the 1 to 99, if you're going from 0 to 100. And there are ways for us to understand our emotions a little bit better. And emotional awareness is also in research. And it's understanding what it feels like to experience emotions in our body. And that's part of emotional regulation and emotional intelligence. Is anger might feel very different in my body than it does in yours. And I might deal with it very differently. I tell my kids sometimes, like, when even excitement, we see that as a behavioral thing with kids, but it's an emotion and they're feeling happy and excited and joyful, and it's very different than an emotion of peacefulness, right? It's still happy, it's still, it's that content, but there's a different level of energy in it. So if we could understand that, if we could be more aware of what emotions feel like in our body. And I'm doing right now this challenge with my second company called Wondergrade, and we have these parents joining the emotionally aware parent challenge. And what's interesting is parents have trouble. They have to take one emotional event every week and break it down. What happened before? How was I feeling before? They think of this visual of a meter, let's say red, green, red, yellow, green, and red, or let's start with green. Green is feeling completely regulated, calm. You're able to focus. You're able to think. Yellow is slightly dysregulated, and that's when there could be something on your mind, a deadline for work, or you had an argument with a spouse that's still lingering and you're trying to get it's still there. You need to get it out and have that conversation with them. Or, anyway, so something can happen that you're slightly dysregulated. And what happens when you're not aware of that is your child spills milk or says something to you and you go from 0 to 100, but it's not. It wasn't 0 to 100. You were already at 30, 40, and it was more of a 40 to 100. And if we can just be aware of those moments or things in our environment that are causing us to feel dysregulated or, emotional or stressed for whatever reason, even when we're in the red zone, sometimes I have these conversations with parents, and red is, you spoke about like a child when they're grieving and something happens and they completely lose it and it came out of nowhere. Maybe somebody passed away a couple months ago or weeks ago, and there's no more cheese in the fridge, and then your child slams the fridge and marches up and yells, and you're like, what? Sorry, was this for cheese?
Yeah.
Or whatever was missing. We do it as adults too, like we have these moments that we can't explain. It's like this little moment of you had zero control, and that's your brain just feeling dysregulated for whatever reason. It lingers and it stays. Our childhood that we spoke about before, if we were part of if we did have a traumatic childhood, or we did have a chaotic childhood, or for some reason the attachment wasn't there with our parents or our caregivers, our nervous system could always be in the yellow zone and we don't even realize it. So the more we can be aware, like my husband and I, we laugh because if you drop a pen around me, or I don't know, sometimes like he comes into the bathroom while I'm putting makeup and I jump. And he's like, but I live in the same house as you. You knew I was here. And my system, I've learned through therapy myself that I am always slightly dysregulated, and I'm aware of it, but it doesn't mean that I can always control it. But I have little moments, whereas him, there could be like this biggest craziness in front of him and he's like, his heart rate doesn't increase, like I don't know how he does it. That actually stresses me out, by the way. I can't handle his calmness. But just to say, we all come with this not naturally built, but our childhood will build our nervous system a certain way that deals with our motivation system, that works with our reward system, with our stress system and emotions. All of those work in concert together. So if we can be more aware of who we are, what triggers us, what makes us feel dysregulated throughout the day, a brand new day is not a brand new slate and a brand new, I had a big argument yesterday and today I'll be fine.
Over.
No, it's not. A brand new day doesn't necessarily mean that it's a clean slate and that you're completely regulated because you just woke up. You could have, I remember like my youngest, like he'd crawl into our bed like before I would kind of wake up and I kind of doze off with him. But then he'd wake me up by like kicking me in the face or something. Like something would happen. I'm waking up in the red zone. And I was very aware of it. But knowing that, I knew that the mornings would be rough. Nothing bad happened. But like, I don't like being woken up that way. Like, I don't like shock.
Of course.
Right? Like, so obviously during breakfast, if a kid didn't want like Cheerios or like I put an extra slice of banana, like I would lose it because I was dysregulated. And just being aware that those things can cause you to feel that way and behave that way. And, we have to be aware of that. And it impacts how we're going to respond to our kids. So if we're in the yellow or red zone, yellow means slightly more chance that you lose it on your child for a reason that you shouldn't have, but you did, and that's okay. Red zone is anything will lead to an explosion. And if we can just be aware of that and then pause. The parents that are part of this challenge are telling us, I'm not necessarily sure what my triggers are, but just pausing in that moment, saying I'm in the yellow zone. That's all you say to yourself. Or I'm in the red zone. I need to walk away because I will respond in a way that I don't want to. I will react actually rather than respond. In the red zone, that's what happens. In the yellow zone, you have more of a chance of reacting, but you can still respond because you're pausing and you can have that inner dialogue with yourself of, I'm tired, or I want to scream because I'm tired, or I want to really lose it right now because I've told them a million times to pick up their mess. True story. And I
don't know anything about that.
Yeah. It's a myth. Yeah. Right. But I tell my kids, I use that language with my kids in the house. I'm feeling dysregulated. They know that word. And I say or sometimes I say I don't have energy, or sometimes I say things like my cup is full. It's about to overflow. And I really need you guys to clean up the mess because when mommy sees a lot of things around the house, I have more of a chance of losing control of my emotions.
Mm-hmm.
They use that language for themselves. Sensory sensitivities is something we didn't talk about 20 years ago.
Right.
And I know that I have it because by 4 or 5 p.m., after being with 3 kids, the noise level gets to me. The touch,
me
somebody
too.
climbing, it gets to me.
Mm-hmm.
And it took awareness of those situations for me to really kind of, I had like this little notebook on the counter and I would just like write down, like, lost it, what time? And it took a couple days and weeks of like, okay, oh, wait a second. I would write down like what annoyed me or frustrated me. And it's like, oh, baby in my arms all day. And 3 o'clock was the time where I was like, I just want like my body to myself, you know?
Yeah.
And by writing just small little thoughts, I
Mm.
made the link and I was like, oh, I don't want to be touched at that moment, or I don't want to hear anything, noise. Like, so instruments or battery operated toys that people give us with love, but don't. Please.
We believe
go,
that it's with love, right?
yes,
We have to believe that.
yeah. Those would be put away around 4 o'clock, you know,
Yeah.
like, because I started understanding my environment and what triggers me and what causes me to feel dysregulated. So that's what I mean by emotional awareness, is really being aware of certain things like that in your environment. And the more you are for yourself, the more you'll be able to guide your child, because you'll say, oh, I know I have sensory sensitivities. Wait a second, after daycare or after school, I've noticed that my child acts out a lot.
Yeah.
Daycare is very noisy as an environment, and we don't realize that the entire day of being there leads to dysregulation, and our child who needs downtime, some calm time. So it's just being aware of what helps our kids. And even with neurodivergent children, just being aware of what triggers them and what leads to emotional outbursts or meltdowns for them, and having it, changing the environment a little bit more, clothing items that might make a difference for them, sound level, noise canceling headphones at breakfast, if you've noticed, or lights that are dimmer. It's that's what I mean by awareness. And I want to I want to really bring that to the forefront so that parents can work on their emotions and their kids.
I think it's really interesting how you were able to kind of research in your own experience. I know that's a scientist in you, right? You
Yeah.
wanted to find out what was going on. But I think and what was interesting, what you said about the not being regulated and in this yellow zone. Maybe I'm going a little too far with this, but I would venture to say that we've all been in a yellow zone for a few years.
Yes. Oh, no, I
right?
agree with you. Yeah.
So I think it's very easy to be set off by something because we've always been kind of like on this alert. And especially as parents, right? We had to send our kids to school. We had to worry about their health, not just our own health. And so it was a lot to handle. And I've heard that from a lot of parents, like jokingly say, if you're feeling a little bit disrupted, or if you're feeling a little bit emotional, it's not just because of X, Y, and Z. It's because we've been through a pandemic and it's still on your mind and it's still a heavy load to bear. So I think, that exercise in your group sounds fantastic. And I think that we could all use it, not just parents, but especially parents.
Yes. But you're right. I think we're stuck in this yellow zone and it's hard to get out. And that's where the self-care piece comes in. And I know we hear a lot of self-care, like go to the spa or do this, but it's more than that. It's our inner dialogue. It's our ability to feel safe and secure. And that there's a lot more to it than just that. It's working on yourself by journaling if you can, or just like, working on communication, working on understanding your attachment, there's so much self-compassion, gratitude. Like there's just a lot that we can do that is a lot more impactful than just going out to the restaurant. That to me is self-care too, by the way. I need connection. For me, like I know my specific needs, like I need connection with friends. For me, I need like deep conversations. I can talk to you for 5 hours and that brings me joy. I know that reading to me and music and just stepping away will help me be a better parent as well. Like that's not selfish. And I think sometimes I felt like that, especially after my first child. You can ask anybody that knows me. I refuse to be away from her. And I was like, no, I'm a mom and I need to be here. And they're like, you're about to pass out. I'm like, no, but I'm a mom. And they're like, go to bed. I'm like, no, I can't. And it was just like this sort of feeling of that I need to do everything for my child and I don't matter. And I only realized after my mental health went down really quickly, actually, after my third child, where I was just like dropping down to the floor and not even sure what's going on with me. And and saying like, what happened, like what's wrong with me, when in the end it's like, what happened to you? Well, you neglected yourself and your mental health, and you were giving yourself to 3 kids, and this is not normal. You can't do that. The
Yeah.
more I learned to take care of myself in a way that makes me feel fulfilled and regulates my system, the more I realize I'm a better parent for my child. They will still have those big emotions.
Sure.
That's normal for them, but I won't have big emotions around it because I'm regulated. So that's the
Mm-hmm.
hard part, in
And
fact.
you know what to do to help yourself.
Yeah. And that's what they should teach us when we have those like prenatal classes. Right? I mean, I remember like showing me how to hold a nurse in the football hold, and nothing helped anyways. When I had a kid, like she was wiggly, and I was like, they told me to hold you like this. Why isn't it working?
Yep.
And what I really needed was for somebody to say it'll be hard and it's okay. It doesn't make you a bad parent. And to teach me how to be compassionate in those moments when I wasn't to myself,
Yeah.
and really understanding what mental health looked like. Even though I studied mental health for my PhD, when I was in it, I would say my mental health really hit after my second child. That's not true. After my first, I didn't recognize the anxiety, that the
Mm.
anxiety around not letting go of my child. After my second, I didn't realize the anxiety, but also the feelings of sadness a little bit that were starting. And then
Mm.
I had 3 kids under 4 years. So by the time I had my third one, I was juggling 2 small kids, and I mean, I know you understand as you have very small, they were twins and close in age,
Yeah.
but by the time I had my third one and had neglected my mental health for,
Mm.
under 3 years or 4 years, then it was like, oh, I can't do this. I can't do this. And I would just call my husband in feelings overwhelmed. But
Mm.
it's just because I neglected my mental health. And I think we need more, and it's not just more like community groups or anything, but it's just more of us talking about this, like saying
Yeah.
I'm experienced. Because every time I tell a mom through my podcast or Curious Neuron somehow, they're like, you went through that? I did too, but I never told anybody because I felt ashamed. And that's what we
That's a
need,
big word, shame, when it
right?
comes to motherhood. Yeah.
We just need, like, people feel so ashamed and like as if they failed or they're weak because they're struggling with their mental health. But it's not. Like, I wish we would just be more open about it, and that we could, especially new moms or new parents now that
Mm.
are starting, they're going to go into this thinking we've all got it right. And that we all went through this and like nobody was affected mentally. Like, it's not true. And
Yeah.
I think the more we can do that, we can start helping the next generation, like even just having conversations. That's all it really is.
Yeah. And I think that, that's the beauty of the podcast, Curious Neuron, is because you're able to bring it to the forefront, talk about it in a way that, parents will understand that they're not alone,
Mm-hmm.
and that there is science backing up everything that they're going through and
Yeah.
everything that they can do to improve it. And I think that, like you said, I mean, this didn't exist, when our parents were going through parenting and their parents. So I think for each generation, it's getting better and better. And I think really, truly, as much as we have, the social media aspect and the, beautifying everything aspect online, we also have a great deal of awareness that it takes more than just, a smiling face to get
Yeah.
through the day. So I think that, there is a movement happening, and I
Mm-hmm.
think that it's so good to have you part of that and helping us along the way. So thank you for that. I
Thank you.
I've been doing the blog for 12 years now, and I love it so much. But I've done it in my own experience. It started with, people asking me questions, and how do you do this, and where do I go for this? And so it became something that I was very proud to do and happy to do, to help others. It's a different voice, right? It's a voice of perhaps understanding or storytelling, and it's a voice of, I've experienced this, so maybe you will too. But I love being able to come to Curious Neuron and having research based information to say, oh yeah, that's what I'm feeling, or that's what's going on, and this is what I can do to improve the situation. So I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Tell me a little bit more about the topics coming up for the podcast, because I know that things are changing, evolving. So tell me a bit
Yes.
about that.
So the past year I've had a bit of a twist, or the past couple of months, Curious Neuron focused on development as a whole, but now the podcast and Curious Neuron is focusing a lot more on emotional health and mental health. We had our 100th episode in February this year, that was Dr. Bruce Perry. I'm still blown away by the fact that I had a conversation with Dr. Bruce Perry, who has the book called What Happened to You, co-written with Oprah. It's a book that really highlights how our childhood impacts who we are today in terms of emotions and mental health. Now that I've started season 5, which I still can't believe we're in season 5, but I started it early because I've had conversations with researchers at McGill who study attachment and are helping us understand all these myths around attachment. Like if your baby cries and you don't hold them, that your attachment is ruined. It's not true. Or like, moms can go to the bathroom and moms can take a shower, and dads could be with the baby too. And we spoke about mental health as well, because dads can have postpartum as well. We need to have these conversations. I'm really lucky. I'm also interviewing the mom in Jane the Virgin, as she has a book coming out, and it's all about like different aspects of mental health in moms and dads. I have dads that are going to be on the show as well. We have researchers that cover all of the aspects of emotional intelligence and emotional health. I want to make sure that I cover everything that a parent has as a question, but then staying true to Curious Neuron, and the podcast is curiosity first and compassion. So when I talk about all these topics, again, it's so that I can hand over the information to parents, and then you decide what you want to do with it. What makes sense for you? What makes sense for your family? And if it's not something you could apply for whatever reason, that's okay too. But as long as you have the information, and it always starts with us as the parent. And I try to remind everybody every single episode that parenting is not easy. It's not easy for me. It's not easy for you. It's not easy for anybody out there. And what you need to do is first be curious and compassionate about yourself, and to try to see like what are little things that you can do to change parts of who you are. I started journaling this past January as my own little mission, and just writing down a sentence of what I'm grateful for at the end of the day. I had recorded a podcast about that. Within 3 weeks, I noticed that I was noticing such small things during my day, and that was bringing me joy. And that was changing my mindset on a day of like being home with 3 kids, homeschooling, starting work at 6 p.m., finishing at midnight, 1 o'clock, next day starts again. I was just seeing things very differently. Those little play moments with my kids, or those little moments of coloring with them, I would journal about it and say I really enjoyed being with them doing that, when I wasn't even noticing that. So there's a lot like of research and stuff. Self-compassion is something also this season that we're going to focus on a lot more. There's just so much research around self-compassion and how changing that can change how you speak to yourself. We had Dr. Ethan Cross a couple seasons ago, who has a book called Chatter. Inner dialogue changes how you deal with certain things as a parent too, how kind you are to yourself. Instead of saying I saying you, and it feels like you're helping a friend. So there's a lot of those topics that we'll be talking about.
We will of course mention it in links, but where can people find you? Where's the best time, place, and links to find you?
So the Curious Neuron Podcast has a new episode every single Monday morning. You can find it anywhere you listen to a podcast, basically Apple Podcasts and Spotify, Google Podcasts, Audible. It's everywhere. And if you are having trouble searching for it, or you're looking for a specific episode, it's easier to search through our website at curiousneuron.com. Up at the top, you can click on podcast and search by person. If you heard of an interview, there's I also interviewed Justin Baldoni and his book Man Enough. It was so good, and just lots of conversations that we can have, about mental health and emotional health. So if you want to search for a certain topic, everything is there on the podcast, on the website as well. And we have an Instagram account, curious_neuron, and anybody can reach me there, or through the website, or just, and I love hearing from people and hearing their questions, because I create content and podcast episodes that way. So I would love that.
Great. That's wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time. I'm so looking forward to the next season of the podcast.
Thank you.
It sounds very exciting, and what everybody needs to listen to help. So thank you, Cindy. And is there anything else you want to add?
No, that was perfect.
All right.